Hello, everybody. I am and continue to be John Atack to this very day. And I am delighted, as always, to welcome my dear friend and colleague, Hoyt Richards. Hi, Hoyt.
Hey, good to see you, John. Here we are in the summer now, right? I mean, things are starting to warm up, heat up a bit.
Yeah, we had a heat wave last week, and now we're having
Really?
the coldest um, first week of July ever
Oh, well,
since recorded history. It's a
it's
little bit
pretty
changeable.
warm. Yeah, it's pretty warm out here in California. It's not as warm as it is back east, but
Well,
you know,
it's Bill Hicks, isn't it? What's the weather? Hot and sunny.
that's it.
Hot
That's
and
it.
sunny.
That's it.
I remember being in LA in January one year, and the Santa Anas had probably just about done their stuff, so you could see things. There was air, and hey, there's Mount Wilson or San Jacinto or what have you. You can see
Right,
it. So,
right,
but for 2 minutes of the year, then it rained, and it
right.
rained, and it rained for 4 days, and the looks on people's faces, the kind of, how could this happen to us? It's like this ordinary English day that we're having.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. It's
Such it
crazy.
is. So, whereof shall we prate today?
Well, yeah, I thought today it'd be interesting to talk about the role the ego plays in our lives, from a massive point of view. But as it relates to the cultic experience, I think the ego has a role in how we get involved in these things. I think we can discuss how in the bombing phase, how quite often we're being seduced through ego related type things. I
Yeah,
think,
we respond to people saying, "Oh, you're so gorgeous and so
yeah,
clever,"
exactly, yeah, all
rather
of
than
that.
going, "Go peddle your papers."
Yeah. Yeah, that, and then obviously once you get involved, there's kind of some reaffirmations amongst the people in there that we're somehow better than everybody else, and
We
it
are the
creates,
elite. Yeah.
that's right, the us versus them thing. And then it also, I think, contributes in the way to prolonging, maybe leaving, because there's ego stuff tied to like how could I be wrong, and I've got to make this work, and then
The consistency principle, as Bob
exactly,
Cialdini calls it,
as Cialdini talks about, exactly, which
throwing good money after bad, or the sunk cost
exactly.
fallacy, or
And and then
inertia, or
and
what have
then and then the other point that we've also discussed in the past, which I really think is critical, and I live with a lot because I deal with a lot of I've talked to a lot of ex-members, even my own group, of where there's such resistance to accountability for what happened, so that they have the humility to admit that they basically got conned in this thing. So the whole recovery process gets stopped because of an ego issue
you.
of just, my favorite quote, and I know I've mentioned it before, is it's much easier to fool a person than to convince a person they've been fooled. I think,
Yeah.
it really comes down to that. So
A
I think
fool
we
and
can,
his folly are seldom parted. There's
that's
another one.
right. That's right. So I think it's an interesting topic to talk about how, yeah, how the ego does play a role. And I think the egos can be something valuable to all of us as well. It's not like the ego's only painted in dark light, but I think it is interesting when you look at the cultic experience, the way it plays out. And I know for me, it was like when I first met the cult leader on the beach when I was 16, he was very effective at kind of, seducing me with the ego, because he would say statements to me that that in hindsight were so manipulative, but at the time I thought like,
You're
oh,
16, right?
he thinks I'm smart. Like he would say he would preface a statement by saying, "Oh, you're very smart. You'll understand this," and then you go into this whole thing. Now that how can I say anything other than, "Oh yeah, I totally get this now,"
Mm, yeah,
because I don't want to be seen in lesser light. And
yeah.
in the same way, he said to me, he looked at my group of friends, and my group of friends had actually known him and in some way vetted him from the point of view that saying he wasn't dangerous. They kind of labeled him as being eccentric. So that also played a factor, that people had talked about him in a way that was at least complimentary, or at least, I wasn't that he was dangerous. And so when he said to me, with total sincerity, I remember it very, very vividly. He goes, "You're different than your friends." And I was like, different how? And he's like, no, he goes, I can see, even in this first conversation with you, you're not like your friends. And all that stuff at the time, I can look back, it's very manipulative. At the time, it's all, that is an ego type of thing of like, oh, I want to be seen as different. I want to be seen as special. I want to, all those type of things really, I think, play a big part that at the time we're unconscious of, right?
Mm.
Um, and it's this whole type of thing that I think flattery works really well. I think, it gets the flattery also gets us in a lot of unhealthy love relationships. We sometimes meet someone who just seems to say all the right things. It seems to get us and kind of overloads us with all this kind of adoration. And that can be almost like a high,
Mm. So it is. It's euphoria, isn't it? Sense
it
of
is, it is. So I'm kind of curious to see, I hear what what you think about this, because I really think it plays a vital role to the entry point, why we stay in, and then ultimately trying to get out and then heal. We're up against that ego all the way through. It seems to be, play its part, and I think it's something worth chatting about.
yeah, absolutely it is. Um, and I think, let's start with the word ego and have a little look at that. It's a Latin word, and I have no Latin really, except to be able to say things like et hoc genus omnes, meaning and more of the
Eminus,
same,
animus, and enemy, or something like that. Yeah, yeah.
animus and anima. And
Anima, right? Yeah.
yeah, and of course, etc., which we have an id est, that is an exemplar gratia, but it's about the same level as my grasp of Italian, which runs to spaghetti carbonara and pizza and that kind of thing. But nonetheless, the
Right,
word ego, I am told, is the Latin word that means
right.
self, and Freud then gives it a new meaning, which I think it comes from him, which we've kind of accepted, which comes from the idea of being egotistical. In fact,
Mhm.
I think Freud actually probably did regard the ego as okay. Then you've got the superego, which is the
Yes,
rules and
right.
instructions we get from others, and the
That's
nasty
right.
little id, which is
The
trying to
id,
make us do
the id.
disgusting things all the time. What a moronic view of humanity, but a lot of people still believe it. But nonetheless, you have the ego, the self. And so that which is egocentric, egotistical, or egoistical, that is pandering to that sense of importance. Craig Malkin, in his, to me, bizarre standard textbook on narcissism, he's Harvard Med School and he's totally
Mhm.
accepted. And I read this book and went, "You are kidding me." And he talks about healthy narcissism and he defines narcissism, world's leading expert. He describes it as the feeling of being special. And so you can feel too special, not special
Mm.
enough, which makes you an echoist, by the way, or you can
Oh,
have healthy narcissism. It's like, so there's a healthy form of depression, there's a healthy form of psychosis. It's like, I think this word has gone way too far. But that
yeah,
sense of feeling special, that I think we live in a culture. Our friend Rachel Bernstein talked about giving a class to adults and asking them to uh, write down a time they were discouraged at school and a time they were encouraged. So this is like what, 13 years of your life in school.
right, right, right,
And I think she said, and I hope Rachel's watching now and can correct me, but I think she said that no one could think of a time when they were encouraged.
right.
And
Oh,
so our need for the love bombing, our need for the flattery, because we live in a culture. I mean,
right.
America's, I found this, I worked this out the other week. In America, it's okay to blow your own trumpet. In the UK, you mustn't admit to having a trumpet. You know,
That's funny.
so there
Yeah,
is a cultural sort of thing that
yeah,
when Donald Trump says in "Think Like a Champion," one of the things people don't know about me is how humble I am,
right. Of
and we
course.
don't know that. He's quite right.
Yes, that's right.
Um,
That's probably one of the more truthful things he said. Yes.
uh,
Yeah, that's
um,
funny.
but so to want some affirmation, to want some encouragement. I was talking to a friend yesterday, and she's 50, and um, she's still hurt by something horrible that her father said about her.
Yeah, right,
And I'm kind of going, yeah, it's true. We do want that affirmation from a parental figure,
right.
and until we've grown up, we need a parental figure. And the problem is that most people will never grow up. And we have a whole advertising culture, a whole
Yeah.
religious culture, a whole political culture, consumer culture that doesn't want you to grow up. Because if you grow up, you'll start making decisions.
Mm.
And that's
Heaven,
not good enough. You've
heaven
got to,
forbid what would happen then. Yes.
yeah.
You would,
So you've got to drink either Coke or Pepsi, and to be a good person. I saw this thing, read this thing about advertising, and it was a Pepsi survey that they did around about 2000. And this guy's saying, when I look at the can, I see the red, white, and blue, and I think about my country. And you go, no, you're being ripped off, mate. It's
yeah,
sugar
yeah.
water. It's just
Yeah,
sugar
exactly.
water.
You've been
But
completely brainwashed by the marketing campaign. Yeah.
so because we don't feel, embraced within our culture, because we don't feel comfortable about who we are and what we are, of course, we're all the more receptive
Yeah.
to somebody coming along and saying, "Oh, you're pretty," or "You're tall," or in my case, "You've got a deep voice." That's about the only nice thing people can think to say about me, I think. Uh,
Oh,
it's true.
please.
I do have
Yeah.
quite a deep voice, but I can
No,
sing
you do.
falsetto.
I've got a great voice. Yeah.
Thank you. I did a documentary thing a year or so back, and it was brilliant because the sound guy, when the second day, put my mic on, and he said, "Have you ever done radio?" And I said, "No." He said, "You've got a great radio voice." And it was like, oh, what a lovely thing.
Yeah.
But I'm what, a guy of 67 or 68 then, and it still gets to the little cockles of my heart to go, yeah, somebody's saying something nice about me,
Sure. Sure.
because it's too rare in our culture. So that's the first layer.
That's where we're vulnerable. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And then we want to parent, and that's what the cult leader will be, whether immediately and charismatically as your cult leader was,
Right.
or at a great bloody distance and supposedly charismatically as Ron Hubbard was to me. We want
Right.
a hero. We want somebody who's a role model. We want to clone ourselves onto
Yeah.
somebody better than we are. And that's all very noble. And in Christianity, you have The Imitation of Christ. Thomas à Kempis called a work that, but it's a significant aspect. You're trying to be like Christ. So what was Christ like?
Yeah.
Well, he was all the good stuff, right? He was all the great things you can be. Of course he was. I want to be those things. And I project them into this new parental figure because, hey,
Right.
guess what? The old
Yeah.
parental figure, the real one, didn't live up to expectations, oddly enough. Just as I won't have done to my 4 children, I'm afraid it can't be done to be a
Yeah.
saint, in human form. Well, I may have met one in my life, the Archbishop of
Yeah.
Crete. He was pretty saintly, but otherwise, we all have feet of clay.
Yeah.
So,
And I think you bring up a great point in the sense that we're kind of inherently wired to follow, right? I mean, we're a social species, and there's strength in numbers. So there's a lot of unconscious, almost probably DNA related kind of need to follow for safety, and it seems like the easier route. It's the path of least resistance, right? Because just as like you said earlier, to figure things out for ourselves, it's a lot more complicated, a lot more complex, and it demands a lot more upon the individual to kind of take on the accountability that I'm going to have to make my own decisions and be responsible for the consequences. To find the person or entity or concept that sounds like, oh, this is the ideal, and I can mirror myself after it, makes sense, but it puts us in a very, very weakened position, and one very vulnerable to be influenced and manipulated. But it feels, that's, I think, what's so interesting about these things. It feels good. And the other part of it that's fascinating to me, certainly with my own experience, was as much as my ego was getting stroked to get into the organization, and and it became the type of thing, that love bombing phase of where and I really look at it kind of not unlike what Rachel says, where even if you come from a fairly healthy family, I think every family has some form of dysfunction, but if loving parents or whatever, it's still never enough. Like someone saying they love you and think you're supposed to, it's like we hardline that addiction to that. Like we can't get enough of that. And then when someone kind of overbears, even overbears with it, it's hard to recognize if we're not told, which we aren't told at a young age, or even at any age sometimes, that feeling good too fast is potentially dangerous.
Yeah.
No one
A very
warns you.
important point. Let's underline
Yeah,
that in red. Feeling good too
yeah.
fast
I
is
mean, no one,
dangerous.
no one warned you about that. And in the same way, I think no one warns someone that when they're at a certain stage in their life where they're maybe starting to question and ask some of those bigger ideas of who am I? Why am I here? What is my purpose? What is my place in the scope of the universe? Because when that happens to someone, usually our friends and even family around us are very supportive, like, oh, that's great. Go investigate, go find, your way. But people don't warn you to say, hey, listen, that's all great. You're opening your mind to these questions, but be careful. Every master manipulator out there will see you like a bullseye. And that's another thing I think is really important to kind of illuminate to not only the populace, but certainly people when they're younger, that if you move into that kind of seeker mode, which is, I think, a really potential opportunity for all of us to grow, that you need to be careful. And
Mm,
that there's the majority of the people that we might come across would not be as authentic as we may think they would be. And I certainly know for me, when I met the cult leader, I was looking for direction in my life. I mean, I was young, I was 16. So
mm,
it's not like many 16-year-olds have a game plan or they have discovered a purpose. But I did feel like I wanted at something
mm,
like that. I wanted to be passionate about something. I wanted to kind of have a direction. And when I met someone who was really excited about their direction, and it certainly paled with my no plan, uh, it was appealing to me. And then for him to compliment me and saying, "Oh, I'm capable of doing something great like this as well," I was really vulnerable.
mm.
And I perceived the whole experience as something positive, and with all those positive emotions, like, oh, someone gets me, someone understands me, someone sees me the way I want to be seen, not recognizing that it was a lot of flattery, it was a lot of ego stroking, and it was a ton of manipulation.
Yeah, for sure. And if we start at the beginning, the little piece of advice to give to our children is nobody knows what's going on. Um,
Yeah,
so
right.
when somebody comes along and says, "I know," then you can be damn sure that they're a con artist.
That they
So
don't. Yes,
yeah,
right.
so if we look at the philosophy of mind,
Yeah.
um, that it comes back to this idea: what is consciousness? And this is called the hard problem by philosophers of mind and
Mhm.
people, psychologists
Right.
work in this area. It's called the hard problem because nobody has answered the question. I mean, I'm reading a book by Jeremy Sherman, who's been working with Terence Deacon, a neuroscientist at Berkeley, for 28 years, and they're seeking to answer some of these questions. And what's being put forward is very interesting, but I still, as yet, don't feel that anybody's explained to me what consciousness
No,
is.
that and it's a completely irrelevant now with the AI. They're like, is AI going to become conscious? And be like, well, what's consciousness? Like,
Yeah,
what are we
exactly.
talking? Like what would qualify that? Yeah, I think it's a fascinating
And will
point
it
here.
send the Terminator to get us?
Yeah,
It's
that's
like,
right.
but
Exactly.
I mean, the one of the many fundamental lies in Scientology, Hubbard, and this bothered me when I first heard it. Hubbard said knowledge is certainty. And even as a 19-year-old, I'm kind of going, I think that intelligent people are the uncertain ones,
Yeah.
the ones who are going, well, that's
I
the
would
best.
concur. I would
Yeah.
really concur with that. Yeah. And you hear that, and like I think was it Plato or Socrates is that the more I learn, the more I realize how little I know.
It's
Right. I think,
attributed to both Socrates and Lao Tzu.
okay,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. He
exactly. I
he
mean,
who
to
knows he
me,
knows nothing. He who knows nothing
exactly. Right.
who knows he
Right.
knows nothing is really nosy or something
Right.
like that.
And that the best teachers are the eternal students, right?
Mm.
That and I find that as well. And it's been actually a lot of the talks that even you and I have had that have helped me in that way of recognizing that that idea of certainty and how much of a trap that is. I think that when I think of some of the big traps, like wanting to be right,
Mm.
is a real trap.
Righteousness.
Yeah, which again is an ego thing, right? I mean, it
Mm.
really is like that,
Yeah.
and or that the people that want to have it all figured out, which you're basically saying, I'm aspiring to be a know-it-all, and I don't know any know-it-alls that I enjoy being around. So, I mean, why would I ever aspire for that?
Mm.
And what I've discovered in my own life is that I can certainly use my life experience in a way to maybe format certain ideas and concepts of how things seem to work
Mm.
and how they tend to play out. And but to go to the extreme of saying, well, this is the way it is, and this is now an absolute truth, I've learned how dangerous that is because ultimately I'm always taking in new information, and that information might nuance one of those ideas I feel pretty secure about
Mm.
and say, oh, it's not exactly just the way I was looking at it. There's more to it, or I might just be wrong. And sometimes new information comes in and says, "Oh, that just wasn't accurate in what I used to think." And
Mm.
so I think the idea that really serves me is to definitely use my life experience as a means to hopefully develop a moral compass so that I can kind of make my way through the world a little bit,
Mm.
better and feel like I'm making healthier decisions. But ultimately, I'm always a work in progress and I can't ever like tick a box and say, oh, that part is definitive. That's a definitive truth. That's the way, that's a law. I just don't feel comfortable doing that anymore. I just always want to
No.
be open and receptive to take in new information that may change the way I look at things. And I
Mm.
think that served me, but it's been a battle to get that point of view because when I certainly know when I was involved with the cult, there were all these definitives like, well, this the way it is, and that, and it's a set of rules and you have to follow them. If you're following them, you'll get praised. If you're not, you're going to be evil and destroyed or hit with some, you're going to get a slam session or just have your ass handed to you because you went against the principles.
Mm.
And, it's this whole idea again of when someone says, well, I need to be right. And it's like, well, according to who? And by what standard? Like, what are you saying?
Mm.
But it really ties into a lot of this ego stuff. It really does.
And people will give their lives to it. People will lay down their lives
Yeah,
to protect abstract notions like
that's correct. Yeah,
patriotism or
yeah.
nation. And so these are strong conceptions. I mean, I'm in my pile of books at the moment. I'm reading a great book. I think the guy's name is David Blight. I think I would have changed my last name, but I probably should anyway. People keep thinking I'm called Attack, and I'm bloody well not. I'm called
Yeah,
ATAC. It means
that's yeah.
at oak, underneath an oak tree. I'm very nice.
Okay.
Get hit by acorns occasionally, um, but this guy wrote a book. He's a Yale professor, I think, and he wrote a book about Reconstruction and the 50 years after the Civil War in the US. And it's amazing seeing the conceptions that were formulated then that became truths. So, for example, the lost cause. So,
Mm,
for the South, there was this idea of the lost cause. Um, why was the war fought? Was it worth losing 620,000 lives? What was achieved? Well, hard to say, really. The land was all
right,
given back to the Southerners.
right.
Black slaves were emancipated and given absolutely nothing and had to go back and work on the plantations in the same deplorable conditions. And lynchings became habitual, all tied
Wow.
up in some kind of belief system.
Right.
And I think that it is so dangerous when um, we kind of subject ourselves. We are subjugated by some belief that
Yes.
then makes it okay. The commonplace for genocide is the vermin argument, that these people we're killing are not people. They
Yes.
are, as the Nazis said, the Jews were rats or they were
Yeah.
fleas. So you
Right.
dehumanize. We've
Exactly.
seen the same thing on both sides with Hamas and with Netanyahu and his people, that they are no
Right.
longer looking at their opponents as people. And
That's Yeah.
They feel themselves superior in some way. Oh, this is starting to sound like being in a cult group. Um,
Yeah.
and that sense of certainty, I mean, Hitler, that was the great thing, that this guy who'd got no idea, he was crazy. He really, you look at the things he said, and some of them are very insightful about how you manipulate people. I mean, this is a
Mhm.
guy that spent months posing in front of the mirror so that he could have a set of photographs taken um, by his official photographer who remained with him right to the end. And these photos, I think they're taken in 1928. They're published as a book once he's achieved power. You can't get a copy of them anymore. I can't. But they sold like 1 million copies. And it's pictures of him going
Wow.
and stuff like this. And you're going, that's who you're looking at. You're looking at a guy who spends his life in front of the mirror making
Right.
poses.
Posing.
This
Right.
isn't, he doesn't actually know anything about economics or
Wow.
warfare or anything like that. But he carried people along with his sense of certainty. And in times of crisis, historically, human beings, the cleverest, 45% of medical doctors in Germany and Austria joined the Nazi party. 45% of them joined it.
Wow.
To give
Wow.
some kind of balance on that, the current Chinese Communist Party, 4% of the people in China belong to it. That's how popular it is.
Oh,
Amazing
really?
thought, eh? Yeah,
I
it's,
didn't
but we don't want statistics like that because that will mean that Chinese people are people.
Yes, of
And they're
course.
not, they're not. They're not human like us, are they? Of course not. No, they eat Chinese
Uh,
food and things.
yeah.
And you start getting these ludicrous distinctions, which are us and them, my cult special, your cult. And it's like, no, we're all human beings. Even if you're biblical about it, we all come from
Right.
Adam and Eve. We're all descended from the same place. We are, as the song goes, family.
Yeah.
And I haven't got all my sisters with me, but nonetheless, we are a
Yeah.
family.
Yeah.
And what's our relationship? This thing of how much in the social contract, in how I deal with people. Um, I I go along with the idea, which I think Evie Blanca put forward, but I don't think it's new to her, but Yuval brought to me, that your friends are your adopted siblings.
Hmm. Yeah.
and and I am so rich in that way. I have so knowing so
Yeah.
many wonderful people, and that relationship, that thing that we can say anything to each other, we can talk about absolutely anything, we will respect one another's confidences.
Yeah.
And if you're in trouble and you need my help, you know, we know that this is going to work if
Yeah.
and when those circumstances arise. That's the relationship it would be nice to have with the whole world,
Yes. I
but it's
agree.
not the relationship we do have. And
No.
as you say, the ego, the self-centeredness, the selfishness that we have,
Exactly.
which is not necessarily or of itself a bad thing. If you don't think about yourself, you're going to walk in front of a car. You've got to
Right. No, no.
occasionally.
And I think that that's a wonderful point you're bringing up because I also know that when I was in the cult, that was like the worst term you could be called. And you're a raging egomaniac. And the way and I'm sure they probably did something similar in Scientology. I don't know if
Mm.
you can tell me, but the way that was done is if in some way, and it wasn't, listen, maybe certain times I was being an egomaniac, but more often than not, it was usually I was demonstrating some sort of pushback against the status quo or what the party line was. And so the way it got framed is any kind of resistance or thinking independently, or maybe thinking a little bit critically and saying, well, hold on, in this situation, I should probably do this. You're being labeled as the egomaniac, which is the worst thing you could be labeled as. And it really manipulates you to hell, the very in the worst way to think lesser of yourself. And that anytime I act outside the guidelines, I'm being an egomaniac. And that was a very, very powerful controlling tactic. And so did they do things like that in Scientology with you or?
So there's a group of people who call themselves Scientology kids who grew up in Scientology. They're not kids
Right.
anymore, and about 3 or 4 years ago, I wrote a piece for Tony Ortega, and I got this amazing email. And if anybody from that group is watching, I would love to be back in touch again.
Mhm.
Because I'd talked about the use of slogans and cliches as a way of stopping thinking. So,
Sure.
and as put downs. And they sent me, I think the original list had 370 Hubbard slogans on it. You're going, you're kidding me. You know, the way
Wow.
out is the way through.
Right.
What's true for you is true. All of these stupid little heuristics, which the way out is the way through. I mean, what does that tell me? You know, the way out is the way out.
Yeah.
His first principle, the dynamic principle of all existence, is survive. And you're going, so that which exists is existing. That's really quite interesting, and it keeps existing. What did I learn? And they're all couched in this way. So there are lots of nothing springs to mind. I'm sure somebody in the comments will add something that is specifically you're being egotistical, perhaps because that's what Scientology wants you to be. It
Yeah.
wants, but you can be a degraded being. You can be a suppressive person. You can be a
Right.
potential trouble source, a fascinating
Yep.
expression, that one, meaning that you're criticizing Scientology or Hubbard in some way,
Right. Yeah, exactly.
not going with the rules. So there are a whole raft of terms. If you're a staff member who's not doing a good job, you're a tiger. And as L. Ron
Right.
Hubbard said, it's a tough universe and only the tigers survive. So bad
Mhm.
staff members are the only people that he was right about that, actually, thinking about it. If you do what he says,
Yeah.
you won't.
It is so interesting because it was you were labeled as being selfish. And it's interesting because I also look at, and I know this is kind of a term that's come through the cult survivor community of what they call the buzz, the idea that you get so hyped up in these group with the grandiosity of
Mm,
whatever, like I know for us, we believed that we were this, even though we were a very small group. I mean, really, when I look at the numbers, the hardcore group, maybe 40, 50. I mean, if
yeah.
I look at the whole 15-year experience of mine, maybe there was another 40 or 50 that came and went. So
Mm,
but you're really talking about 100 people or so. So it was never very big, but the concept that we all glommed onto is that we had this incredibly important work and we were going to affect the planet on this global scale, and that we had this huge importance that we were going
mm,
to be the leaders of the new age and all this kind of BS
mm,
that, again, totally tantalizing my ego and all that sort of things. And I know that when I was struggling at the height, like getting close to when I was ready to leave, one of the impediments was I was okay with the idea that I was screwing up my own life. Like that to me sound inevitable because they had spent 20 years telling me what a loser I was and what a bad person I was, and how I just failed in all these attempts to become this self-enlightened being. But the role that I was supposed to play, this grand role of where I was going to be in a position to help not just thousands, but millions of people,
mm,
that idea that I would be the way, because we believed in the law of karma. So the fact that I would be karmically responsible for those millions of people that I was supposed to help really made me hunker down and keep trying to make it work
mm,
and not leave.
mm,
That was a great impediment for me because that whole idea that, like, it was okay for me to screw up my own life, but because I was supposed to achieve this role where I was going to do this something great, that really became something that made me hang in a lot longer than would have, I probably would have ever. And it's all
mm,
tied to this ego stuff,
mm,
right? And likewise, even when I finally did escape and I figured out that really what it was, and that alone took me and probably another year and a half. I didn't figure it out while I was in the group and then say, oh my God, I'm in a cult. I need to run away. These people are bad. It wasn't anything like that. I actually escaped under the guise that I just couldn't measure up. I wasn't good
yeah.
enough. I was holding them back. I was dead weight. I was a hopeless cause and they were never going to give up on me, but I knew it was a waste of their time. And the least I could do is relieve them of this lost cause. And that's how I left. But even when I did figure it out after kind of enduring my version of PTSD or CPTSD, whatever way you want to look at
Mm.
it, when I awakened to the fact, okay, this is a cult, and then I know what this means now, and had read Steve's book, the psychological crash. So I'm like, so I thought I was going to do this grandiose role in the fabric of history. Now I realize that was all this manipulation and BS, but there was still a part of my brain that's like, well, even though it was BS, that got me out of bed every day. Like I thought I was going to do something important. Like I can't go to McDonald's and start flipping burgers. That's crazy. Like what's ever going to get me motivated again? And
Mm.
that whole psychological crash, I think, is again tied to a lot of this ego stuff. But that was tough stuff to work through. That was tough stuff to
Mm.
kind of come to grips with. And a lot of it was becoming accountable for how much my ego had played a role in getting me involved in this whole thing. And I think this is one of the things that's so healthy for a survivor to do is really lean into the accountability of, well, what role did I play in my own demise from a certain point of view? Like let me look at it honestly and just recognize I was vulnerable there and they played on that stuff and I fell prey to it because I kind of on some level wanted it to be true. And what does that say about me? And what does that, what do I need to reflect about and how do I need to maybe not do that in the future? And I think all of that's a really, really important, path to consider. And that was, but that's some tough work to go through and tough times to kind of figure out. But I think it's really the work that needs to get done, in my opinion.
I agree, and we have to look at, you know, as you say, we want to belong. Um, Society is very important. I mean, we understand, at the moment, the National Health Service in this country recommends mindfulness meditation for people with depression. And I go, you are kidding me. You're looking in too much and you need to look in a bit more. What you need to do is get society. What you need to do is get out there, talk with people, do
Mm,
something to help others. If you really want to, and I'm not talking about endogenous depression. That is a medical condition, and I understand
right,
it's not going to
right,
be solved. But 80% of people who are reckoned to have depression and are put on, you know, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors like Prozac actually have a reactive depression, which is to say they're unhappy. And they
mm,
have a reason to be unhappy. Their spouse has left them, or, their hedgehogs died, or something
right,
terrible has happened. And there's a reason to be unhappy. And the best way to get over that is to have society, is to be with people. Because with the exception of the 3% of men and 1% of women who are psychopaths, the rest of us actually, and there are schizoid types and schizotype,
right,
or,
right,
there are a tiny percentage of people who don't need other people. Um, and they're fine doing what they're doing. But probably 95% of us need society. Now, society has within it groupthink.
yeah,
I think along with my group, of course I do. I think
yeah,
about the benefits to my family, to my friends, to me. And it's hard to question those things and say, well, actually, my very good friend has just said something really stupid to me and I shouldn't believe it. I should
mm,
do something about it. It's very easy to just go along with the groupthink. But you
yes,
then, underneath all of this, you have the obedience training that is fundamental to our educational system. So we are taught to follow. We are taught
yes,
that teacher knows best. And there are different models. I've talked often about Matthew Lipman's work, Socrates for
mm,
6-year-olds, the wonderful little video that's on YouTube somewhere, where he said, filling people full of information and saying, I know everything. This is a really wrong standpoint. We should all be part of a community of learning, teachers and pupils alike. I mean, I certainly find that's the truth. Everybody I speak to teaches me something. Um, Even if occasionally it's that I shouldn't be listening to them, but there you
right, yeah,
go. But to to that attitude within society means that, you know, my late friend, Lady Daphne Vane, who did great work in the countercult field. And I remember talking with her, and we were talking about, when does it begin, this vulnerability? And she said, you take it in with your mother's milk. And it's
Wow.
true,
Yeah, I think I agree with that. Yeah, and I think it's part of the human experience. I really
very
do.
much.
Yeah, and I think again, the account to take just taking that on, wearing that mantle and being okay with that is a huge thing to accept, and a lot of people resist. I think because again, the place of being of just accepting being vulnerable is quite a egoless state, right? I have at times, taken some of the plant medicines, and the plant medicine experience for me is always this kind of ego crusher
Yeah.
from the point of view of I'm in this expanded state of mind, and anything that I've kind of held on to, like, well, this is the way this is, and this, and it's like, oh, really, that's the way that is. Well, what about this? What about that? What about? And you're like, okay, maybe I don't know so much, and that, but it can be quite intense for that reason, because I realize in that heightened state how much I'm holding on to and how much I self-identify, going back to things that you said, certain beliefs or certain
Mm.
principles or certain, they all, and one of the things I've loved about our conversations over the years is how you've taught me about idealism, and how that is ultimately a very kind of cultic binary point of view, very black and white, the truth, justice, and the American way. It's like, well, what, what
Make
is that?
America great again. When was it
Yeah,
great? Are we talking the
right.
Marshall Plan? Are we talking presidential reconstruction?
Right.
When was the great bit? Let's do that. Was it Tammany
Yeah.
Hall? Was it
Yeah.
the FBI with Hoover? Was it Nixon? Which is the great bit? And
Right.
the only place we've got to with that so far is where Trump, bless him, said that he was the second greatest president after Abraham Lincoln.
Oh my goodness.
And the
That's so
one thing people don't know about me.
I mean, it is priceless, and I think if you're able to move into this perspective, you do develop a bit of a sense of humor about it all. I certainly know for me, yeah, and this again, and I'm not saying that people need to do plant medicines. I'm just saying what it has taught me in those states is to really not take myself too seriously, and certainly not even take the world too seriously from that point of view. That because I think part of the way the cultic experience manifested in me was this idea of identifying a perspective of the world that was basically negative. Like, the world's screwed up, it's fucked up, and we need to go fix it. Which is, again, such an egotistical point of view to say, like, oh, I've got the answers to the world. I mean, it's outrageous, but it's tied in this package of, like, don't you want to be part of the movement that's going to go save the world? And it's like,
Not
well,
really.
what's well, exactly. And what the perspective I've learned is, for me, that serves me, is I try to look at it like Earth School. I am here and wearing my Earth costume, and I'm taking my Earth lessons at Earth School. And clearly, when I've learned those Earth lessons, I'm going to take off my Earth costume and I'll go back into another state that's not about this realm. Okay. And from that point of view, everything that exists that I perceive in the world is exactly as it is meant to be, to teach me. So to say that it's right or wrong, or it needs fixing, that's not really appropriate, in the sense that I can certainly have my feelings about it and say, I wish this was different, or I watch the presidential debates and I think, like, I wish we had
Who
better
are these
choices in our
fools?
country, or, so I can certainly look at things and say, okay, I have feelings about them, and that allows me to build a kind of moral compass to get me through life. So it definitely serves me in that way. But to get on a soapbox and think I know how to fix things, or how the world should be, or what is right, or how these people are wrong, or I'm better than that, but all that stuff is just not serving me. And it's all very, very tied to a very egotistical mindset. And
And
I've
it,
really realized that does not serve me.
yeah, I bring everything back to a very simple equation, which is about growing up, becoming
Yeah,
adult, taking responsibility for your own mind
yeah.
and your own actions and your own words,
Mhm.
and taking a, a less doctrinaire, less dogmatic view of the world,
Yeah,
accepting that it's wonderful that people have, we're in a pluralistic society, that people have different views. And I
right.
don't find myself, looking at, I have a friend who tells me that we should be frightened of Islam. So it's not Islamophobia. It's not and I'm kind of, well, 99% of Muslims are just getting on with their lives.
Yeah,
1% of them are Wahhabi, Salafi, or
right.
in
Or radical, yeah,
one of the
right.
Shiite factions.
Yeah,
But the majority of people don't want to do that kind of stuff, and
yeah,
we get caught up in a group. So I don't have any difficulty in going and reading Rumi or Hafez or any of the great Sufi poets and going, wow, their metaphor is not my metaphor, but I get that they've seen something. What you
right.
say about plant medicines, um, I think anything that alters your perception, I think
Mhm.
of it as like going onto another hill and looking from there instead of the
Right,
one you
right.
normally look from.
Another perspective, right.
Yeah, and I, I find that in conversation with other people. I find that in reading, um, and that sustains me, that keeps me going. But I think it's important, even if somebody is going to drink, and that's going to give them a different perspective, and it's good to
Mhm.
have those different perspectives and to try and understand things from other people's point of view.
I agree,
So
I agree. Yeah,
I think where we're leading is the thought that the ego, the self-obsession, the room full of mirrors, as Jimi Hendrix called it,
right.
that really gets in the way of getting over the experience. But often as not, it's not that you had this perfected human being who then was distorted by involvement in a cult and now has to get back to perfection. We
Right.
weren't perfect.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
the development we need to undertake is to be mature, is to and that would mean having a compassion for our species,
Yeah,
caring about, understanding that saving the planet is actually about making sure that there's a future for our species on the planet. And that in turn means making sure there's a future for most of the other species. The tsetse fly and the mosquito can go wherever they like. I don't want them. So maintaining everything, all of the, not so happy about them. Um, but to grow up, to not be one of the things I was talking about the Kubler-Ross 5 stages of grieving, which I don't like anything that's been pushed into a model, and I, oh, now you've got to feel this. But it
yeah,
does seem that a lot of people leave a group in denial, first stage, that they don't realize. It's like if you say you were in a cult, they go, no, I was in the Moonies. You
yeah,
in
right.
Scientology were in a cult. I was in the Moonies.
Yeah, yeah,
And so, it's not a pejorative term. It just means a group that is devoted to a leader and or a teaching. That's what the
yeah,
word means.
yeah,
Oxford English Dictionary first entered the language in 1711. This is what I'm known for, isn't it? These ludicrous and, who cares that the first recorded usage of the word, but it was, which is to say it's a long time ago.
yeah,
And more recently, it's been perverted,
yeah.
and I blame the Americans for this. It's been perverted by the Heritage Dictionary in the 19th century, starting to make a pejorative meaning of the word
Yeah.
cult. It doesn't mean anything negative. Sect, cult, group, organization, whichever word
Mm.
you like, who cares? But this is about a group that is dedicated to a teaching and often is not a leader. And seeing that our whole society is constructed of cults and subcults. Margaret Singer, when she wrote Cults in Our Midst, which is still one of the great works about
Yeah,
cults.
it's great.
Um,
Myself, right over there, yeah.
yeah,
Yeah,
with Janja, with Janja Lalic. It's one of the books
yeah,
they wrote together. Um, But I remember talking with her and saying, and I think she says in the book too, cults in our midst is because I think all of our society is, interlocking nests of cults.
Yeah.
So we have political parties, religions, but you don't have to be cultic. You don't have to do as you're told. You don't have
Mm.
to think as you're told. You can actually ask questions, which leads us to intelligent disobedience. My friend Ira Chalef's great work, which everybody should read because it's a really good read. It's really short, and it brings over this point that we need to be disobedient.
Yeah.
Oscar Wilde said, "Disobedience is man's original virtue." He also said youth is wasted on the young, but I think age is wasted on the old. Um,
I like that.
but
I like that.
we
Yeah.
our minds are like kaleidoscopes. You've got, I read yesterday that they're saying 86 billion neurons, and you've got about the same amount of glial cells, which are never mentioned, or we don't talk about them. And they've actually found this mechanism that functions with the glial cells, that they're actually cleaning your brain out at night.
Mm.
And one of the things, and this is according to Matthew Walker at Berkeley, who's a sleep specialist, wrote a very interesting book called Why We Sleep, which has certain things I would disagree with in it. But that's who I am. If I don't disagree with something, then
Yeah.
I got to watch out here. But we have these glial or glue cells, if we translate it from the fancy
Yeah.
Latin. We have these glue cells, and they busily at night when we sleep, in deep sleep, are cleaning everything out. If you don't sleep enough, if you don't have deep sleep, you are so much more likely to get dementia
Oh,
because they will help clean out the plaque.
right.
And plaques.
That's a very, very common thing in a lot of cultic groups is that you lack of sleep, and that's a
It's a
most common.
commonplace in our whole society, and it's
Yeah.
accepted. And people don't realize that it's one of the most damaging things you can do to yourself. Yeah, I talk
Yeah.
with people. I remember talking to a woman who'd worked directly for David Miscavige in their the Gilman Hot Springs in California,
Right.
and she told me that she got 2 hours sleep a night, and
Oh
my
my.
jaw dropped. It was like
Yeah.
that your immune system won't work, your memory won't work, you won't be able to concentrate. You'll
Yeah.
have, you know, you'll virtually go into a kind of bipolar state where you'll get ecstatically high and then depressed and
Yeah.
low.
No, exactly. I mean, in our group, sleep was frowned upon. The guy who was running at the time, this guy David Seaman, you would basically be reprimanded. Like, I'm exhausted. I got to go take a nap. And he would give you this scouring look like you were some weakened being for the fact you had to shut your eyes. Yeah, it was crazy.
And
Yeah.
it's so often the case, in Scientology, one of the good things, and there are good things as well,
Yeah.
is that you can't have the auditing unless you've had sufficient sleep.
Yeah.
And that's sensible. The problem, however, is that Hubbard probably realized that if you haven't had enough sleep, the suggestions won't fix as easily. So
Oh, I see.
could be a downside to that one. Um,
Interesting.
but in this kaleidoscope where you've got 86 billion neurons firing, and they can have anywhere up to 200 different states, and there are 3,200 different forms of neuron. That's what's going on in your head,
Wow.
all of that
Wow.
stuff. And we create neural pathways, and we feel very uncomfortable if something disagrees with something that's wired in our brains.
Yeah, because
And
and correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding of that is when we do repetitive actions,
mm,
our neural pathways basically get streamlined. They build, I think it's called like a myelin sheath, which is kind of
yeah,
like a hard thing that actually makes us be able to do that. It's kind of what you learn when you do sports, when you keep doing something repetitive and
mm,
you get better at it, it becomes second nature to the point where you don't even think about it. It
mm.
becomes almost, an unconscious act. Then if you choose or you feel the need to change it, you have to kind of break through that neural, pathway in that myelin sheath, which is very difficult to do because your body's been so conditioned to create it, to speed it up to create a new pathway takes a lot of effort and a lot
Yeah,
of
it's the rule of first impressions that it is very hard to undo something we
Right,
believe, and
right.
um, it can take quite.
And that's, I think they call that truth bias, isn't it? Like the idea that, and people do this in courts. They realize that if they say something, even knowing it's inaccurate, if the jury hears it, they will unconsciously take the first impression, even if they're told by the judge that was inaccurate,
Yeah.
strike that from the
Oh
record,
yeah,
it
yeah.
stays in there.
Of course it does. Of course it
Yeah,
does. And the
yeah,
biases are really quite awful. Years ago, I saw a documentary about a man who was sent to prison and served 20 years for murdering his partner,
right.
and it was discovered that somebody else had done it, that there was absolutely no way he'd done it. And when they went back and looked at the trial, he'd he'd worn a suit. I used to make
Mhm.
this mistake in court, like a pinstripe suit. He had glasses and he had lots of files in front of him. This is just me in court. This is just the way I was, and I lost as
Right.
well. Um, and the jury didn't like him. The jury came to the attitude that he was, because he was telling the lawyers what to do, and they thought he was an arrogant person, and they therefore
Oh,
sentenced him, found him
wow.
guilty when he wasn't, and there was nothing
Wow.
beyond circumstantial evidence. So how we perceive things, if they violate our view, if they go
Yeah.
against what we believe, it becomes the cognitive dissonance
Yes. Yes. Of
becomes too
course.
much. And again, I think that an aspect of maturity is the acceptance of cognitive dissonance. If
Yeah.
somebody disagrees with me, I hope they'll do it politely.
Yeah.
They'll disagree agreeably. Then I appreciate them. I
Yeah.
am grateful. I realized a long time ago that the normal default setting for a human being is don't prove me wrong. Don't correct me. Even if I am wrong, I don't want to be corrected. Of
Yeah.
course you don't. And so you learn this thing of taking the person aside so it won't be in front of a group.
Right.
So you can say, actually, it's not pronounced Copenhagen, it's pronounced Kubenhaven, um, which is a really useful thing to know. Um,
Yes.
and and the reason why is quite interesting, that we pronounce things the way sailors pronounce them. So
Mm.
a renegato becomes renegade. But for a while in
Oh.
English, it was runagate. There's a good
Oh.
word for you.
Interesting. I didn't know that. Wow.
But so being able to be disagreed with and feeling comfortable about that humility, that where you say, and um, it, it becomes useful. A friend of mine edited Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, and he went through the manuscript 5 times before it
Right.
went to publication. And it was quite distressing. He was an incredibly clever man. He'd been a rocket scientist who then became a psychologist. So,
Hmm.
he was smart.
Yeah.
But he had no understanding of feelings at
Oh,
all. So he would
uh-huh.
write in the margin, "Are you some kind of idiot believing this?"
Wow.
But I came away from the experience. He's the only person I've ever regarded as a mentor, because even though he was angry most of the time,
Right.
what he said was relevant. And it really helped me to go, I am not going to think about my petty little ego here. I'm going to
Right.
think about what's right and the
Yeah.
best way forward. And I think it's a part of growing up, growing a slightly thicker skin, not not getting into, well, you said these things about me, and I'm really, doing things privately that need to be done privately, and rejoicing in challenge. What tends to happen is that people leave a group, they'll go into denial. Half the
Yes.
people who leave won't do anything about it. They'll
That's
just live the
correct.
rest of their lives as if the instruction set, the software, the
Right.
malware that's been put in there didn't matter. You
Yeah.
can just
No,
keep on
no,
believing these
I,
things.
I think it's the biggest problem. And I think, and I think it goes back to something else we talked about in other podcasts about trauma. I think that there's a denial of not only their role in it, but we're also recognizing that they were traumatized in this
They
thing,
were
and there's a
wounded.
Yeah,
were
exactly.
wounded. Yeah.
There's a resistance to diving into how that happened and what that means and how that makes you feel because it's so uncomfortable, right?
Yeah,
And
exactly. And it's best to just repress it and forget it.
right.
Well, no, it
Eh,
isn't, because it'll
or
always be
think
there.
to think I can put it in the rearview mirror and just move forward. And
Mm.
the way I like to frame it, these experiences are like having a car accident. And then you can't go forward and say, well, I didn't have a car accident. I'm like, look, I can see the scars on your body from where the car accident. You had the car. They're like, no, no, what are you talking about? I didn't have the car accident.
Mm.
And that doesn't serve us in any way.
And you don't
And
have to fix the car before you keep driving.
that's
You,
right.
you
And
do.
it's fascinating because I think, and you see it a lot, even in relationships that I would call cultic relationships, where we've kind of unconsciously given our power away, and someone's now used that kind of unhealthy power dynamic to then control and potentially abuse us.
Yeah.
And people generally find a way out of that relationship because it is so painful and it is so awful. But then the more common reaction is to just put that in the rear view and move forward, and then usually find another version of that relationship again and not
Exactly.
understand why.
Yeah.
And
Keep
and
replaying it.
right, and it just becomes, again, talking about what we talked about before, having the humility to go back to some of those wounds, some of those original wounds, and the ones that have been put in that rearview mirror, and start to say, well, what really happened there, and how did it happen? What role did I play? And all that type of process allows the opportunity to really learn from and be taught by the experience, which I can only attribute to the reason though why it happened. The whole point of having the experience is, in theory, to teach me something.
Mm.
So for me to just say the experience either didn't happen, which is the denial, or try to just label it as in one brush, like, oh, it was bad, so I'm not gonna think about it. That's never accurate. Like any experience we have is multifaceted as far
Mm.
as having, shades of gray. Like it's not just, oh, it was all bad, it was all good. That's just not the way life plays out. But it is such a hard thing, I think, for people to humble themselves to recognize that not only what happened was painful, but they have a role in that,
Mm.
and the role they played in either going along or having their ego stroked, which allowed them to become more vulnerable. All those type of factors teach us about ourselves, teach us about the world we live in, and potentially give us the opportunity, as you've talked about, to mature and to start
Mm.
acting like an adult and recognize that we are vulnerable to things, and that if we don't have our ego in check, that someone can manipulate us, and that if we have tendencies towards wanting to think that we know something or we're better than someone, that's probably going to get us in some hot water at some point. And
Mm.
all those sort of things become things that we can only start to deal with if we only begin to take ownership that they're happening. And that takes a certain degree of humility and addressing the role the ego played in getting us in those situations.
Yeah. And I mean, I am very strong on, you have to reconsider the beliefs,
Yeah,
because you will not be free of them until you've looked at them. And
yeah,
some of them you may go, yeah, I still believe that. That looks
yeah,
fine to me. But you need to think about it and weed out the ones that were actually crushing you, were actually belittling you, were actually, or on the other end, were making you feel that you were part of the elect and superior. The
yeah.
reality about human beings is there is no perfect human being as yet. Obviously, I come very close to it, but
One of the things I love
but
about you, John. That's true. Yeah,
but we all have our competences and
yeah,
things we're
right.
not good at, and that
Yeah,
makes us socially good. This cult leaders know everything, but
yeah, of
like
course.
Ron
Yeah,
Hubbard told us how to put flowers into what Americans call a vase, what we call a vase,
right.
and not to bang it against the faucet, which we call a tap, because you might break it, and that kind of micro control and the all-knowing attitude is anybody who is putting forward that view is wrong. There
Yeah.
is one thing which I think is also very relevant. That's when people come out of denial in Kubler-Ross's model, they go into anger.
Mm,
And what we are seeing out there at the moment is an absolute forest fire among ex-Mormons,
mm,
ex-Moonies.
yeah.
I don't know if the ex-Christians are doing it. They probably are.
Yeah.
Ex-Jehovah's Witnesses. There are factions forming and people fighting against each other and taking the anger that they feel, quite
Yeah.
understandably, about their cultic experience and now projecting it into this experience and
Yes.
saying, these people are now my enemies, rather than understanding that, um, as Gandhi said, and St. Paul is often said to have said, um, hate the sin, but not the sinner.
Yeah.
I
Exactly.
think that's the quite right quote. People say,
Yeah.
love the sinner. I don't think Gandhi said that. He said, hate the sin, but not the sinner. And understanding that it is the doctrine, it is the idea that somebody holds, whether it's Nazism or Scientology or whatever it is, that is damaging and that will
Yeah.
cause damage. So getting those ideas out of your head, but also calming down. Maturity
I
doesn't
agree.
mean
And I
being
think,
a rage
and that is never, when you're in that angry phase, which, as you
righteousness.
said, yeah, is not the time to be going public.
Mm,
Because I think it is a natural
yeah,
phase of the recovery process. Like there's some ownership of the victimization, in the sense that I didn't want to get involved with this. I'm a good person. I didn't want to do these things that they made me do, and identify them as the culprit, and give them the blame and all these sort of things. And again, that is a natural. I went through that. I mean, so I certainly think that is part of the recovery process.
it can often happen, and of course everybody's recovery process is different. There are
Yeah.
people who can just walk away.
Right,
I,
exactly,
I have
exactly.
met
Yeah,
such people, but there
but I
aren't
had a
many of
version.
us.
Yes, that's true. And I really had a version of that. And I certainly, I actually went public quite early on, in not a very good format. It was one of these kind of shows that they'll interview, but then they'll cut it into like a 3 or 4 minute piece. So it was really not a smart move. But I didn't know any better, and
No, no, we all
I was
started
so
there.
desperate to kind of just, I had a history at this point of being on public defending the group. So I wanted to set the record straight that I'm out, and this is bad group, and they did bad things to me, and they're bad people, like that sort of thing. And when I actually have, because of the doc project I'm working on, I got access to the raw interview, which was interesting for me to watch, because there are actually certain things that I say, I'm like, oh, I can see that's actually a good point I raised. Now, I didn't make it into the cut because that wasn't, appropriate for what they wanted the audience to hear. But what was interesting about it was I could see at that stage, I could connect some dots and intellectually process, oh, this is what happened, and this is why I did what I did, and this is how mind control works, or this is how
Mm,
manipulation works, or these type of things. But what was clear is I could articulate what had happened, but boy, you could see there was no emotional processing. Like I didn't have ownership of it at
yeah,
all. And I could just talk about it. And that again is not a time, in my opinion, to go public, because there's a disconnect at that stage. And
yeah.
it certainly was for me in the recovery, because the emotional processing, and like you said, it can be different for other people. But for me, that has been something that seems to just be a lifelong journey of mine, like emotionally processing that trauma. It just continues to evolve, and I actually perceive it as something like it's the gift that keeps giving me, because of that trauma, and because of what it brought up so many things for me about myself and the world we live in. It becomes this constant reservoir that, as I take in new information and self-reflect back on some of those experiences, sometimes I figure out a better way to nuance what I've said before, like, oh, there's actually a better way to express this, or now that I've taken this new information, oh, I think I haven't represented it very accurately. This is the better way to say it, and I've really found it to be something that I really enjoy, that process of recognizing that there is no perfect way to express what I've gone through, and it continues to serve me as I take ownership of it.
Mm.
but that, that resistance to, um, allow the time for that to process and just want to vindicate myself and let everyone know I'm not a bad person. I didn't want to do this. That's not a great time to go public. I think there's a point when you get through that, and then you start to say to yourself, okay, the truth is I was brainwashed. Truth is I was manipulated. I was kind of coerced in these different ways. But not unlike a drunk driver who goes out and kills someone, that doesn't give me the hall pass to say I didn't kill someone. Like I did, if I got in my car and drove drunk and killed
Mm.
someone, I don't get the hall pass for saying I was drunk. So in the same way, even though I was brainwashed, I'm still accountable for everything I said, everything I did, and the ones that I've talked about in the past that are more challenging for me are, the things where I chose to remain silent when there was clearly something going on that I was not comfortable with, and or I chose just not to interfere because I didn't want the attention to come on me, which might cause me more pain.
Mhm.
And I think when you lean into that type of accountability, and that's a very humble, egoless state, like to say, like, listen, okay, I was under an influence, but that doesn't mean I get the hall pass.
Yeah,
That,
and it is finding the balance of accountability, of responsibility, understanding what it is in us that attracted us, made this thing
exactly
attractive to us. Um, and they're getting into a cult, as Yuval Noah says, it's you walked in dogmas.
right.
That's the
Yeah,
explanation. It wasn't because
yeah,
there was something wrong with you. You were at the wrong place, the wrong time, and you got stuff on your
yeah,
shoe.
yeah.
But and
Exactly.
people will spend decades trying to work that out, and you're going, no, you're just in the wrong place at the wrong
Yeah, I
time.
like to call it the
However,
perfect storm. Yeah,
yeah,
it's a number of factors that line up and just
mm,
allow this thing to happen. Yeah.
yeah,
You
and
happen to
and
turn the corner and you couldn't see the dog crap, and you just, there it is.
yeah, you're running along, and there it was. Okay, well, yeah, this has been great, and I've got to run. Um,
Yes, well, good. I'm glad we
um,
had this chat, but I think it was fun to kind of touch on this, and hopefully the audience enjoyed that, because I
yeah,
certainly did. I always enjoy our talks.
and I'll get Spike to tell you when it goes up, so that you can look at the comments and
Okay,
make
good.
rude
Yeah,
remarks about what people say.
that's right. Hoyt, I
Grand.
just think you're an egomaniac.
Yeah, get over yourself.
Exactly.
I was in a cult. It did me nothing but good.
Exactly. That's great. All right. Well,
Thanks so
enjoy your
much.
day. Send my love to Pamela. Great to
Yeah.
see you as always.
Yeah,
Okay.
likewise. And Pamela sends her love to you. She made a
Okay.
point of it.
Cheers. All
Grand.
right.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.